Hey, what's up, guys? How's it going? So, I'm going to try and explain wall trapping as much as I can, and kind of give you some insight on like how the previous video that I showed you about how to wall trap without a leader, how that one went down. I'll give you a little bit more info. So, to get into the topic, right? Again, I'm sure most of you have probably seen T4S Vegeta, and a bunch of other guys have kind of been, they've been nitpicking the wall trap concept for quite some time. Now, to answer the question of like kind of how that happened and the way it did, is I think it boils down into the fact that you need to be conscious of a couple of things. One or two things that are incredibly important, right? It's that when you send a tier 4 march, right? Generally speaking, if your attack stats are below that of the defense by so much that eventually, at a certain amount of wall health, you can't go over the wall, it's going to bounce. And so in this case, right, when it comes to wall trapping, ultimately what I'm doing is I'm buffing up the trap HP and the trap attack, because those are really the only two things that I personally feel like are of any value. And then squad attack for the range, because the range are going to be on top of your wall. And so I'm actually maximizing that as well. But in the case of that video, I didn't have any of that. But with it, obviously, there's a lot more involved in it. Now, in terms of traps, okay, at the time, all right, the only two traps that I have are tier 3 range and then tier 4 boulders, or basically burning logs. Now, ultimately, these traps do come into play, and one of the few reasons why I actually went with this route rather than, say, go all into all three is because ultimately the amount of traps you have is kind of going to ultimately determine how many you're going to have at the end. So in this case, I decided that I was going to maximize as much as I could into basically like a 3/4 ratio in terms of what I've got. So a third of that being, or 3/4 of it going essentially, whatever. Either way, math is hard. But the point is that essentially I have more burning logs than I do than the actual towers. Now, of course, I could have skyscrapers, and I'm probably going to be moving my way up to that, but the resource cost for the actual traps will change due to that. But ultimately, the idea is to have as many wall traps as you can and maximize the 125. And then what you do, and this is when you have a leader, and this is the way you're supposed to do it, is you need to go through, you got to make sure your defense tree is completely done. And then go down to your upgrade defense tree. And ultimately, the key part that makes this all work is the defense. So somebody that is tier 4 is probably going to be pushing anywhere between 4 to 600% with army attack. So anywhere between that amount is about what they're going to be sending. So if you've got like an 11 billion champ player with 11k heroes, all the above, he's probably pushing 700%. So in order to counter that, you're going to need 600 or higher in terms of actual wall defense, or it's going to potentially fall. But the second problem you're going to run into is obviously the traps themselves, because you can have a wall that's really, really strong, but not have any traps and do no damage. And that's why what I'm doing is essentially I maximize the amount of HP that I'm getting out of my traps and the amount of damage that they do, because that essentially gives me just that much more in trap that I can use. Of course, you could use trap defense to give yourself a little bit, but for the most part, my core opinion on this is that you want to maximize trap attack and maximize wall defense, and you don't want to ignore the HP either. Those are like core components to what makes this work, because if you ignore either or, it's going to come down flat. Now, I don't feel like trap defense is as important, but it is something that you don't want to completely ignore. It's just when it comes to priority, trap attack is on the priority list, then HP, then defense. When it comes to the wall, it goes defense, HP, and that's it. But when it comes to priority, I'm always putting ahead the wall defense over just about everything. Now, of course, the repair speed is something that we all know is incredibly viable for actually making it so that if you do lose your wall health and it continues to drop, this is what's going to make it a little bit cheaper to rebuild. Granted, the walls themselves are not something that a lot of people would recommend even having. And a lot of the time, a lot of us out there that have even said anything about it, it's usually because it gives you too much might. But to answer your questions in terms of why do I build the setup that I do, it's because at this point in the game, all right, and this is the way, and this is my honest opinion on the wall trap, is that it works wonderfully if you've already completed your military research. If you've already gone out of your way and completely done all of your unit traps and all that, at that point, okay, when you're about 200 to 100, well, anywhere between 150 to 200 million byte, you're not going to get soloed very often anyway. And so what this allows me to do is, once that's completely maxed out, I could get away with not having any troops in my base, and the wall will still hold up, at least for an attack or two. And it really depends on who it's going to be, because, obviously if you get 375,000 from a certain Tier 4 player, it may not end so well. But ultimately, the idea is that when you max out all of those particular stats and you go into your talents and you maximize your trap attack, and obviously you want to maximize your ranged offense, those are things that are going to come in handy. Now, obviously, the setup that I'm using is I'm also not ignoring the HP, because, again, the HP is incredibly important in keeping those troops alive. Then again, you've probably noticed the setup that I like to use, and again, it's not a perfect setup, but it could always be better, is to basically have a lot of Tier 1 range and then immediately have some Tier 3 range as well as Tier 4 range. But I'm trying to maximize the amount of cavalry I have and the amount of infantry. I don't ignore those, because it's essentially the logic for a trap account is no different when you're setting it up to eat solos. The mindset is really actually about identical in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So essentially what I'm saying is like, you'll notice that when I actually put on the wall troll gear, okay, and there's a lot of gear out there you could choose from. There's a couple of places where you can switch between the Orb of Pestilence, which would give you a lot more trap HP and attack, which is great if you know the guy that is attacking is either a really weaker Tier 4 player, is sending really great gear. Then you might want the Orb of Pestilence. But you also could just as easily find yourself in a situation where you're with a Billy Mike Champ player, and so maybe having more added towards your wall defense is more viable. The same could be said with like the Deathly Mantle, where you can add trap attack, but you could just as easily switch over to a grimy plate just to add that much more wall defense in case that really became a concern. And again, the same could be said even for the accessories, interestingly enough, because you can choose between Blight Rings for the wall defense, or you can actually choose between the Ivory Chokers for the actual trap attack and defense. Now, ultimately, the way I understand it, and this is the way I'm using it right now, is that what I'm doing is I'm maximizing the amount of infantry traps that I have on the wall. And the idea is that if I knock out most of the troops that are outside that wall, if that wall crumbles, I will have range. But because they don't have enough infantry, because those traps have taken out a good portion of them, that the cavalry that I have in that back there will hopefully crush whatever's in there before it even becomes an interest of, I've ran out of troop space. And what this does is basically give you that ability to eat solos if you can't already with so little. I mean, and I'm saying that like you don't actually need like 1 million or 2 million troops. Like, it makes it so that somebody even super small can handle themselves in these kind of situations, and it works wonderfully well. But again, I say these things, but it's not going to apply to everybody. Because again, where I've maximized my traps stats and everything, I've also maximized my military stats. And I would say for those of you out there that are just starting out and are interested in the defense research, I'm always going to say this, but it is a late game kind of thing that you can use. You can use it in the early game, and it's going to work great, I think, for those of you that are wanting to trap with just the wall. But obviously, the one problem with any kind of defense, really, in the end, is that eventually you are going to get capped. There is eventually a point at which you are either going to lose too much wall health, and therefore you can no longer take attacks. And the same way a trap account, if he gets hit too many times and runs out of troop space, he will have to stop what he's doing. No different. Same rule applies. But because of my situation, I'm able to rally. And so I'm not limited to just defense. I can go out and do offense. And so that's where, in my opinion, this has really came out to come in handy. Because again, if you're wondering how do you get soloed at 250 to 260 million, it's actually a lot easier than it sounds. What you have to do, though, is you have to acknowledge the fact that the people you are up against will know what troop composition you are using. Now, a lot of people out there would say that that is completely heinous to do. To allow someone to scout you is a horrible, horrible, horrible idea. But for the type of stuff that I do, obviously you guys have seen me zeroed out on multiple occasions. But where I fail, I've always learned something about what they're doing that actually is a really useful trigger to actually take advantage of. So in the case of, like, say, maybe I'm doing a rally or I'm soloing somebody out, whatever the case might be, if I start clearing them out, the first initial reaction is that they're going to scout me. What they'll find is that I've only got 500,000 troops, and that, to a lot of people, is an easy solo. So the initial reaction is either I will solo this person or I will rally this person. And depending on the type of person I will run into, whether it be a Billiamite player who might just start popping like crazy, of which, obviously, I usually like to go about 1 to 2 attacks and then I random. And I do that because I want to avoid the possibility of that wall going all the way down. But I could probably stretch it as far as 3 or 4, depending on the player. But a lot of the time, it's safe to say if it's a Billiamite champ player with 11k, you might just want to random right away on the first hit. But you never know. And again, these are limits that, I haven't really experienced it, but I know that the limits are there. And I've seen the limits, and I can see where they're at. And it seems to me that, it's about 1 to 2, depending on the player. But ultimately, right, what I'm doing is that, so if, let's say and again, I go back to the fact that, if I'm getting rallied or something like that, if somebody rallies me, all right, I can dump my troops, put them in a shelter, throw them in a dark nest, because what I've done is I've gone out of my way to get the dark nest research. And again, if you're wondering what research am I talking about, again, if I have this, you notice that this is 300,000. Okay, a very valuable piece of advice I can give any of you is that you want to get that research as quick as you possibly can, because you go down the military command branch, get your shelter all the way maxed, and then do yourself a favor and get the Darkness invasion, because that will give you another 50,000 to your army size, which just gives you that much more that you can hide. And a fun trick to do, and this is my personal favorite, is that when someone scouts you and you have your troops in a dark nest, they do not see them. They will not see them. So if I have my troops in a dark nest, they have no idea. All they see is the troops that I have in my base, which is only 2 to 300,000 tier 1. So they just think, oh yeah, easy solo. And then I can pop that darkness, and all of a sudden, where did that come from? That's one little way that I can trick people to do, the kind of attacks that I want them to do, with having an anti-scout not being available. Now, granted, obviously that doesn't always happen. Sometimes somebody will rally me, and the possibility of that is, just like anything. You go out, you go into the end of the map, and you wait until they either march or they don't. Either way, it doesn't matter. But obviously, if they do follow it through and say you get burned, then the only 2 ways that you can really recover are with the familiars. Now, as of late, we've only recently had this, but the Mole Shaman is going to give you about 50% back once you've gotten this ability maxed out, which helps you a little bit. That'll give you just enough health that if somebody comes by and wants to solo you again, you'll have enough to at least take another hit, potentially. But even still, if they get through the wall, it's designed in such a way that it's like a trap gun in my case, so that even if you get through that wall, you're still going to have to go through the troops, and that isn't going to happen. So by the time I random, and I'm safe to go. And a lot of the time in those kind of situations, I like to give myself room so that, if I'm in Fury, that's a bad situation. But if I don't have Fury, that I'm perfectly able to shield at any given point that I'm just completely tapped out. But again, those are just some things that I recommend you guys try out. And this is the advice that I have that I can give you for as far as, the wall trap and all of the other tidbits that I have on trapping in the past. But again, I hope you guys found this video helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.